Carl, if we were like stranded somewhere and we ran out of food, do you think, like, ethically speaking, you could, like, kill me and eat me? At least think about it a few minutes, Carl. Jeez. You've thought this through, haven't you? Oh, really? A good dream you had. Hello there, and welcome to this video in our lecture series on the problem of evil. Today, we're going to discuss the Theodicy of Thomas J. Oord. Oord's Theodicy is interesting because it combines features of process theodicy with some of the other theodicies that we've already explored. It's also interesting because, unlike many of the other theodicies that we've explored, Oord claims that he has absolutely solved the problem of evil. You heard me right, a theodicy that does not fall back on mystery and does not leave any loose ends. That's a bold claim, much bolder than most of the theodicies we've explored up to this point. Let's see if it holds up. To examine the validity of Oord's confidence, we're going to do a few things in this video. First, we're going to list the 5 essential claims of Oord's theodicy. Second, we're going to unpack those claims to provide some context to his theodicy. Unpacking these ideas will help us to understand Oord's understanding of God, especially in relationship to creation, and his understanding of evil. After that, we're going to use our categorizing questions to position Oord on our chart with regard to God's responsibility and God's power. Next, we're going to apply our 3 diagnostic questions to Oord's theodicy. Finally, we'll end with a critical evaluation of Oord's theodicy. So, without further ado, in the words of a very wise man, let's get started. Yes, Carl, I am quoting myself, so what? I think I'm wise. I think you're stupid. Big deal. Oord's theodicy rests on 5 essential claims. First, that God cannot prevent genuine evil from occurring. Second, God experiences all the pain and suffering of creation. Third, God is constantly seeking to heal creation. Fourth, God is constantly working to bring good out of bad. And finally, God requires our cooperation in these efforts. Let's unpack some of these claims by looking at the broader context within which Oord develops his theodicy. Oord's theology falls into the camp of open and relational theologies. We've already encountered a number of people who fall into this camp. These include Greg Boyd, John Polkinghorne, John Cobb, and David Ray Griffin. Oord summarizes what he perceives to be the basic tenets of open and relational theologies. The first of which is, God's love is primary. Because God's love is primary, God always seeks to offer the world freedom, agency, indeterminacy. In other words, God seeks to make the world a genuine other with which God can relate in love. That is, an other that can reciprocate God's love. Because God is love, God does not violate creation's integrity, but rather works with and within creation's integrity to bring about good ends. We've already seen this claim in the work of Polkinghorne, Cobb, and Griffin. Finally, God experiences time along with the created order. It follows that the future is unknown, even to God. God experiences it along with us, can be surprised and disappointed. It also follows that God is not in exhaustive control. Creatures have genuine freedom. The creation has genuine integrity, indeterminacy. God's will can be disappointed. And as a result of this disappointment, of course, God can suffer with creation. What makes Oord's theology so unique is really the centerpiece of it, his idea of essential kenosis. You'll recall that Hick, Boyd, and Polkinghorne all maintain that God voluntarily set aside power in order to develop a world with which God could have a genuine rapport. God could have done otherwise. God could have chosen to create a world where God constantly intervenes, or create no world at all. In this sense, God's will is primary. God is free to do what God wants to do. God is not under any compulsion. You'll also recall that Cobb and Griffin maintain that God is bound by some sense to external realities, the chaos that co-eternally exists alongside of God, or external factors that come to bear on the way reality simply is. In other words, we can think of God as being limited by external realities. Oord is going to be nestled in between these views. He's going to claim that God's essential nature is uncontrolling love. That is, love that does not coerce, but welcomes into relationship. Because this is part of God's essential nature, God's will always act in line with this nature. it follows that God could not choose to coercively undermine creation. God could not choose to overcome evil by sheer force of will. In this sense, God's limitation, if we can call it that, is not voluntary, as it was with Hick, Boyd, and Polkinghorne. It is involuntary. God does not choose to act in these loving ways toward creation. God must act in these ways. This is what Oord means by the notion of essential kenosis. For Oord, the idea of essential kenosis develops from a number of fundamental claims. First, God's nature is love. Second, God's love is essentially uncontrolling. Third, an uncontrolling love will constantly seek to provide others with space so that they can control themselves. That is, that they have some sense of freedom. Love not only does not control, love seeks to set free. That is, to provide some control to others. Fourth, love is primary in God's nature. It is the essential keystone of all of God's being. It follows that all other of God's attributes are in some sense secondary to God's love. We cannot truly understand God's power until we understand it in light of God's love. And again, this also applies to God's will. God's will is always at the service of God's loving nature. It follows that there are many things that God simply cannot choose to do because God is love. For Oord, it follows from these claims that God must seek to provide the created order with some kind of law-like integrity that allows the created order to develop in its own way. This is very similar to John Polkinghorne's notion of allowing the creation to make itself. Of course, the difference here again is, for Oord, God does not choose to do this. God must do this. God must provide creation with this otherness that makes creation a candidate for a genuine relationship, a reciprocal love with God. Furthermore, because God is uncontrolling love, God cannot undo the integrity that God has gifted to creation. God can't just change the laws of nature to bring about what God desires. Now, there's an interesting logical corollary of Oord's claims about God and love. If God is love, and a loving God would always seek to create, but also would always seek to create a particular kind of creation, it must follow that as long as God has existed, God has been creating. Again, this is not an act of choice for God. This is simply the outpouring of God's nature through God's will. From this perspective, Oord takes a unique line with regard to the notion of creation. He rejects the claims of Boyd and Polkinghorne and Hick, who maintain that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. But he also rejects the claims of Cobb and Griffin, who maintain that God created the order out of some pre-existing chaos. For Oord, God has created everything that exists, but God has been creating for all eternity, and always creating out of that which God has previously created. And that might sound a little bit dizzying, but it does make some sense. Again, because God is love, and love seeks to create, God always has been creating. It follows from this idea that creation, as an aspect of existence, has always been in existence. In other words, the creation is as eternal as God. That doesn't mean that everything that exists right now in this moment is as eternal as God. But it does mean that as long as God has existed, something that God has created has also existed. But again, God can't create just any kind of creation. God's love dictates that God must create a creation that has freedom, integrity, indeterminacy. God must create a creation that is, in the words of Oord, finely tuned for love. By the way, Carl, that's gotta be the name of the next big hit single, right? Finely tuned for love? I mean, it's all there. Tuned, the double meaning, it's beautiful. Oh, it's going to be totally screamer rock. Absolutely. Hardcore screamer rock. I mean, the title just lends itself to that, I think. Two ideas follow from this claim. First, God must seek to provide a law-like regularity for the creation. This is necessary for creation's integrity. Second, God must uphold this regularity in creation. In other words, God can't intervene throughout the regularity to bring about God's will. So this raises the question, how then does God act in the world? If God can't act coercively, can't intervene to overturn creation's order, how does God act in the world? Oord is going to take a very similar line to Cobb and Griffin here. God is always present in the world, seeking to bring about the ends that God desires. However, God never acts coercively in the world. And again, for Oord, God not acting coercively is not a matter of will. It's not like when we saw in Polkinghorne or Boyd that God simply chooses not to act coercively. God can't do it. It's just not in God's nature to act that way. In other words, God can't engage in some Jedi mind trick on creation. Carl, you remember that time I pulled a Jedi mind trick on you? And I made you lay on the ground for a long time and not move? Oh yeah, that's right. That was just when I took you off my hand and threw you on the ground because you're a puppet. That's the point, Carl, right there. A puppet can't truly love. right? It can only move when it is coercively moved. So you're just, not capable of love, man. I'm sorry.
Hello, Carl here. Just wanted to jump in and say that I think this whole video and these whole ideas about love and agency and all that stuff is just a load of crap. Seriously, everything that I do, I'm in complete, total control of. Whoa, what's happening? What's happening?
You see now?
Oh my gosh!
Existential angst. But even if God can't do Jedi mind tricks, that raises another question. Why can't God physically coerce sometimes? After all, we can imagine a scenario where physical coercion seems to be a loving thing to do. If a toddler's running toward traffic or a cliff, you would physically coerce the child to pull the child away. Why does God not act in those kinds of ways? Oord acknowledges that these kinds of coercive actions can be loving, and so he doesn't think that God's not acting in this way has anything to do necessarily with God's character or nature being loving. For Oord, God does not act in these ways because God doesn't have a localized physical body. And, as Oord argues, you cannot engage in physical coercion if you don't have a physical body. It's like he's never seen that movie Ghost, right? You just gotta practice hard enough. You can move the penny. Oh, that wasn't an actual documentary? So of course this raises the question, what about miracles? If God can't act in these coercive ways, either physically or metaphysically, how can God bring about miraculous events? Oord's understanding of miracles is very similar to that of Polkinghorne. A miracle is not an occasion in which God intervenes in creation to overturn creation's integrity or law-like regularity or order. God is always working in with a created order to bring about good things. A miracle is when a unique opportunity to bring about good things happens within the created order. A miracle occurs when God is particularly successful at doing this in a unique way. And this will lead us to another question. Can all miracles be explained non-coercively? Let's take the big miracle, the resurrection of Jesus. Here's a guy who was dead for, 48 hours or so, then comes back from the dead. Can this really occur without God overturning the order of nature? According to Oord, it can, and it did. There are two parts to his explanation. According to Oord, after we die, we do not instantly lose agency. Both our mind and our bodies continue to function in some ways. They are therefore still able to respond to God's luring. It follows for Oord that Jesus' body and his mind, his will, could have responded positively to God's luring toward resurrection. Jesus' body and will cooperated with God to bring about the miracle. Oord maintains that Jesus also has a divine aspect, and this divine aspect also cooperated with God's lure toward resurrection. In Oord's estimation, this cooperation of the divine aspect and the human aspect, both body and mind, with the luring of God, leads to a non-coercive resurrection of Jesus. And this is kind of a pattern for all miracles. A miracle occurs when creation and God work together in harmony to bring about something uniquely good and beautiful. This gives us a good depiction of Oord's understanding of God. God is love. God is non-coercive love. God seeks to secure freedom for the other. God respects the freedom of the other. God cannot intervene coercively in any case, but God is constantly luring creation toward the good in every case. So let's talk for a moment about Oord's understanding of evil. Oord's understanding of evil is essentially the same as David Ray Griffin's understanding of evil, and Oord even uses the same term, genuine evil. For Oord, a genuine evil is a gratuitous evil, an unnecessary evil. Similar to Griffin, it's an evil that if it hadn't occurred, the world on the whole would have been a better place. So how do we decide if an evil is genuine or not? I've come up with a flowchart for a way to establish whether or not something is a genuine evil. Essentially, when an event occurs, we have to ask three fundamental questions of the event. First, is the event harmful? If the answer is no, not a genuine evil. If the answer is yes, we have to go to the second question. Is the event the least harmful way to secure a particular good? If the event is not the least harmful way to secure a particular good, then it qualifies as a genuine evil. If it is the least harmful way to secure a particular good, we have to then go to our third question. And the third question is the overall good produced in the production of the harm proportionately greater than the overall harm itself? If the answer is yes, that the overall good outweighs the overall harm, it is not a genuine evil. Because in this case, that evil or that harm is necessary to bring about a particular good. If the good that is produced is not proportionally greater than the harm itself, then we are back to the idea that this is a genuine evil. So what kind of things count as a genuine evil? Well, Oord notes a few different cases. He suggests that instances of rape and diseases like cancer are almost intrinsically understood as genuine evils. It follows from this claim that Oord's understanding of genuine evil includes both moral and natural evils. Moral in the case of rape, natural in the case of cancer. At least when the cancer is not caused by human negligence or something like that. So what about those harms that exist that are not gratuitous? The term genuine evil suggests that other evils aren't really evil. They're not genuine. And this is exactly what Oord maintains. If a harm is not a genuine evil, it's still a harm. We still might think of it as a bad thing, but it's not really the kind of evil that a theodicy has to contend with. Only genuine evils present the real problem for a theodicy. Given these claims, let's take a moment to chart Oord according to our categorizing questions. First, is God responsible for evil? For Oord, the answer is definitively no. God is not responsible for evil. And here, of course, we mean not responsible for genuine evils. God is not responsible because God must create in the way that God creates, and God cannot coercively intervene to prevent or stop evils from occurring. And that takes us to our next question. Can God stop or prevent evil? No, for Oord, God cannot. God cannot because God cannot coerce in a metaphysical sense, Jedi mind tricks, and God cannot coerce physically because God lacks a localized body. I can't believe that wasn't a documentary. Seriously, all this time I was like, oh, good for those two. You know, happy story. That whole pottery scene, it's lost all meaning for me anymore. These ideas also begin to help us understand our diagnostic questions. How did evil originate? Genuine evil originates because God creates a world in which creatures have freedom, agency. There is indeterminacy, even within the law-like regularity of the created order. This freedom entails the necessary risk of genuine evils occurring. So to our second question, why does evil persist, and persist to the degree that it persists? Well, quite simply because God cannot coercively stop it. Now, that does not mean God is not trying to stop it. Oord maintains that God is always doing God's best to bring about good and to bring good out of evil. But he also maintains that God requires our cooperation that God doesn't always get. So God is doing the best that God can do to lure all of us into cooperating with God to prevent and stop evil from occurring. But God can't force us to do this. Therefore, there are a number of evils that aren't prevented or stopped. But at any rate, God is not morally culpable for these evils occurring because God is doing everything in God's power to stop them, to prevent them. So what about our third diagnostic question? Will God eliminate evil? Oord envisions a future in which God non-coercively brings about the redemption of all things. This redemption will be definitive. Oord defines it as, quote, a final victory for all things at the end of history. That's very similar to traditional ideas of eschatology, but it even goes a bit further because Oord is really focusing on all things, not just humans. There's a lot of affinity here between Oord and Eastern Orthodox theologians, who have a much more comprehensive eschatology than many Western theologians do. So what will this victory look like? Oord relies on Paul's vision in Romans 8. He maintains that essential kenosis provides a basis of hope that all creation will be set free from its bondage to decay. In other words, Oord's vision of the eschatological victory over evil is really nothing short than the end of entropy itself, or the re-envisioning of entropy such that decay doesn't even occur. And for Oord, Jesus is the foretaste of this eschatological redemption. And just as Jesus' resurrection happened without divine coercion, but with a cooperation between the divine and the human, so also eschatological redemption will happen not as a result of God's coercion, but as a result of cooperation between God and the created order. Let's turn now to a critical evaluation of Oord's thoughts. And again, let's start with what's good about it. Oord has provided a brilliant and intriguing combination of other themes from other theodicies. His notion of essential kenosis is an important contribution to the conversation, not just on theodicy, but on the doctrine of God at large. Oord also takes efforts to take the findings of others seriously. He's read Hick, he's read Polkinghorne, he's read Cobb and Griffin. Oord also takes seriously the fields of science, biblical studies, and theology. He combines these fields to provide a very solid foundation for his views. The result of all this work is an innovative theodicy, and one that I take seriously enough that I think it needs to be included in this video series lecture. But recall that Oord said that he solved the problem of evil. No appeal to mystery, no loose ends. Solution. The question is, did Oord actually accomplish this? In my mind, the answer is definitively no. By way of explaining this response, allow me to provide a few critiques of Oord's theodicy. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some of the highlights of some of the main critiques that I think have some teeth. First, you'll recall that Oord maintains that God must, according to God's nature, lure the creation toward a law-like regularity that is finely tuned for love. The order that we actually live in seems finely tuned for intelligent life, and it seems like this would be necessary for it to be finely tuned for love. But if that's true, Oord says some other things that make less sense. For example, he maintains that cancer is an example of genuine evil. However, as we've noted from previous videos, cancer is the statistical inevitability of the very law-like regularity of creation that enables it to evolve forward and make itself. In other words, cancer, which Oord labels as a genuine evil, seems to be an inevitable outcome of a creation finely tuned for love. Or we might say, if cancer is not an inevitable outcome of a creation finely tuned for love, if we could possibly envision another order, another law-like regularity of the cosmos in which cancer was not an inevitability, we have to ask, why did God not bring that order about? If the answer to this question is that God tried to bring that order about but was unable, again we have to ask, why was God unable to do it? What forces stood in God's way that kept God from luring creation toward this law-like regularity? On the one hand, it's unclear what forces would have stopped God from bringing about a different law-like regularity in which cancer was inevitable. On the other hand, if this is the only law-like regularity in which love is possible, then it also follows that cancer cannot be a genuine evil, because it's an inevitable outcome of that order. So did God lure the world toward a law-like regularity in which cancer was inevitable, or did God fail at luring the world toward a different law-like regularity in which cancer was not inevitable? And if God failed, why? Second, bodily coercion and divine action. You'll recall that Oord accepts that certain kinds of physical coercion can be loving. He maintains that God does not engage in this kind of physical coercion because God does not have a localized physical body. However, Oord also maintains that Jesus was human and divine. He also maintains that Jesus experienced a bodily resurrection. He also maintained that in the bodily resurrection, the body of Jesus cooperated perfectly with the will of the divine. Now, traditionally speaking, theologians have maintained that Jesus' bodily resurrection entails that Jesus still has a body. This body has ascended to heaven, whatever that means, but there is still a body. It seems to follow that God would have access to a localized physical body, the body of Jesus. So the question, why does God not use this body to engage in certain physical coercions and save people? But there's a broader issue at work here as well. The incarnation suggests that God can interact with physical bodies such that the physical bodies are both human and divine. That is, incarnation is possible. So why doesn't God do this more often? Not just with Jesus' body, but with any body. Now, of course, Oord could here respond that God is constantly trying to do that. In fact, that's what we mean by the notion of cooperation with God. But it also seems that Oord maintains that Jesus' body was a unique example of union between human and divine. And if that's true, we have to ask, why does God not engage in more assumption of bodily material so that God can bring about better outcomes in the world? Third, is the definitive victory over evil that Oord envisions really reasonable? Consider two things. First, Oord maintains that God is always doing God's best to bring about good in the world. It follows that any time you stop and look around the world, you are looking at the best God could accomplish, given God's power. Every harm, every instance of genuine evil that you can imagine in the history of the created order represents God's best. To me, it doesn't seem too controversial to say that God's track record in bringing about the good and preventing evil doesn't really seem that impressive. It includes mass extinctions, genocide, horrendous diseases in infants, and so much more. Now, to be clear, this claim doesn't suggest that God is morally bad. It rather suggests that God's track record in bringing about the good up to this point doesn't seem to give us a lot of reasonable confidence in the kind of definitive victory over evil that Oord envisions. But recall that Oord maintains that God is always working toward the good, and God will always keep working toward the good. Perhaps if God has enough time, God will be able to bring about these changes in the created order. But recall now that Oord maintains that God has always been creating out of that which God has already created. That means that at any point in time, when you look around and you see all the evils in the world, that is the best that God can do after an eternity of creating. If this is the best that God can do with an eternity of creating, how can we reasonably hope for better if God just has more time? Fourth, does Oord's account of Jesus' resurrection really make sense? Oord maintains that Jesus' body and mind cooperated with the divine luring toward resurrection. But bear in mind that Jesus' body, according to the gospel accounts, had been dead for a solid 48 hours. There are cases of resuscitation after near-death experiences where people come back, but not after 48 hours. The kinds of decay that would have already occurred in Jesus' brain, rigor mortis setting in, so on and so forth, the cooperation of Jesus' body with the divine lore doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, scientifically, the brain cells would be dead without the body functioning as it would. If Jesus really did come back, it seems like he would have actually come back like a zombie. Not a whole lot of thoughtfulness, and possibly trying to eat our brains. Oh man, Jesus as a zombie? I would totally watch that movie. Absolutely, Carl. I would watch it. Fifth, we also here have to deal with the issue of the plight of the individuals. I'm not going to focus on this too much here because my comments would be almost identical to my critique of process theodicy from last week. So if you want to hear the thoughts on my critique of the notion of individuals in this kind of a theodicy, go back to the process theodicy video and watch that. Sixth, God's will is not responsible for the horrendous suffering of creatures, but God's nature is. Oord's theodicy provides us with a unique out that not all other theodicies do. See, in other theodicies, God chooses to create and create in this way. Therefore, God is responsible for that which God creates. In Oord's theodicy, God does not choose to create. God must create, and create in this way. But Oord's theodicy still leaves us with a God who lures the world toward a law-like regularity in which innocent, unwilling creatures will inevitably and disproportionately suffer tremendous harms. And again, there's little hope for the redemption of these creatures, given God's track record up to this point. These creatures are not the victims of God's will, as they were in other theodicies. They're the victims of God's nature. But think about what this means. For many creatures, perhaps most creatures that have existed, the world would be better for them if God's nature were not uncontrolling love. Because such a God could reach out and intervene and protect them. Such a God could guarantee their redemption in an eschatological victory over evil. In other words, from the perspective of the many victims of God's creation, God's uncontrolling love isn't really good news. It's kind of bad news. Because these creatures are not the beneficiary of God's love. They're the victims of it. In conclusion, Oord has offered a fascinating theodicy, one that definitely deserves a place among the other theodicies in terms of the conversation. His idea of essential kenosis presents a unique understanding of God. His notion of God always creating out of that which God has already created is a very innovative understanding of creation that ties nicely with his understanding of God. His notion that God cannot metaphysically or physically coerce does explain why God does not act to prevent or stop evil. But the manner in which Oord protects God's innocence in terms of prevention or stopping evil, Oord also seems to take away reasonable confidence that God can bring about a definitive victory over evil. Then again, we're stuck with a God who lured creation toward an order in which so many harms were inevitable, seemingly knowing full well that God can't guarantee redemption or even reasonably promise redemption for those individuals. Furthermore, within Oord's own theological construct, there do seem to be loose ends, unanswered questions, if not outright contradictions. So, if none of the theodicies that we've looked at up to this point really definitively settle the question, if none of them solve the problem of evil, what do we do now? Next week, we're going to discuss a very different approach to the problem of evil called anti-theodicy. This will provide us with a helpful balance to the efforts of theodicy that we've explored over the past few weeks. Until then, Carl and I wish you farewell. And again, Carl only does it because I force him to do it. Carl, does that mean I don't love you? What are you going to do? There's always two, Carl. There's always two.